Shalom. Our Torah portion this week is Parshat Va-Yera, and we start with the 18th chapter of Genesis. Abraham is recovering from entering into a covenant with God through the Brit Milah, the circumcision. Abraham is sitting in his tent, he's infirmed, when he sees from afar three strangers on the horizon. Unbeknownst to our patriarch, they are messengers. They're angelic beings coming to visit Abraham. Despite his own pain, he rushes to receive these three unknown souls who are, he thought, just passing through in their journeys. Abraham begs them to stay. He pleads with them to let him take care of them. And so soon he, his wife Sarah, his son Yishmael, all attend to these strangers. The rabbis paint a beautiful portrait of Abraham, that this was Abraham and Sarah's innate goodness. The rabbis go so far as to imagine that their tent was constantly open on all sides. That way they could easily watch for passing travelers along the road and welcome all of them. And on this day, the special day he was recovering from the circumcision, that goodness is even more apparent in this week's Torah portion. These visitors are, as I said, messengers. They will soon deliver a miraculous announcement from God that in a year's time, Sarah will bear Abraham a son. And Sarah and Abraham, by now both advanced in age, will hear this message and will not believe it. But in this week's Sedra, we will see the birth of Isaac. Now, I want to focus, though, on the actual visit of these three messengers and Abraham's hospitality to these strangers. The Torah indicates that when these angels appeared, Abraham was actually in the presence of God. Beautifully, our rabbis teach us, as they see the text, that God was in the tent visiting Abraham, his convalescing friend. But typical of Abraham and his goodness, when he sees the strangers over the horizon, he forgot his pain. He turned away from God to attend to them. As I said, he rushes to these strangers. He bows before them. He begs them to please allow him and his family to provide food, rest, and shelter. After preparing the meal, after presenting it to them, the Torah says as follows: Vaiten lifnehem v'hu omeid alehem tachat ha'etz vayuchelu. And he, Abraham, placed the food before them, and then stood over them under the tree, and they did eat. The words that are interesting are stood over them. I always read that like Abraham was a trusted servant. He stood over them, waiting for them to finish. But that's not the way the great 20th century philosopher Martin Buber sees it. He teaches us the words of another great individual, Rabbi Zusia, who interprets the text, he stood over them, to be saying that the text is declaring that at that point, Abraham stood above the angels in stature, because he was doing something angels are incapable of doing, and that is sanctifying actions. Angels can only do what they are created to do by God. They have to obey. Angels follow God's commands. Human beings, Rabbi Zusia explains, human beings have free will. We don't have to. But when we do, we are able to take anything that we do, any act, even the preparation of food, and create a sacred and holy moment. And that's what Abraham did. And that's what it meant. He stood over them. I think what Rabbi Zusia is teaching, and it's great teaching, is that here was Abraham. clearly struggling after his circumcision. Abraham was in pain. Abraham was also in the presence of God, which I interpret to mean locked in prayer, pleading with God, asking God for relief. But then he sees strangers, people who need him, and he forgets his own self. He rises up and rushes to offer them comfort and food. These were divine beings. And when Abraham rose above his own self, Rabbi Zussi is right, he stood over them. He did what no angel can do, namely take a moment and sanctify that moment by suppressing the self in the service of others. My friends, you and I have seen so often, whether it's a member of your own family, someone you know, or someone you've heard about who at a time where their own needs should have been first and foremost in their minds, chose to be there for another person. Angels have no choice. Angels perform the will of God. But when we as human beings learn to rise above our nature in the selfless service of others, we can stand above even divine beings. My hope and prayer is that may we all strive for that level of goodness in our lives.